Today on Caught for Two, a spoiler-free review of the 4 Crime Dossier gamebooks from Dennis Wheatley and J.G.Links. Why do these books from the 1930s mark the birth of the modern mystery suspect cold case game? How do they compare to modern games, and are they worth hunting down today? Stay tuned to find out. It's not clear at all to me the best way to do these spoiler-free reviews of mystery games because I don't want to tell you too much about it. I don't want to set your expectations too high. So we're going to try something a little different this time. I'm going to break this review into 2 main parts. I'm going to try to give you sort of a bottom line summary and ranking of these 4 games, so that if you want to play them, you can go play them and then come back and watch the second half, which will still be spoiler-free, but I'll do a deeper dive into the design elements. And you can either watch that after you play it, if you think you might play it, or if you're sure you're not going to play these games, you could watch this whole thing now. Okay, a little bit of preliminaries. There's 4 books in this set. I've played them all on YouTube live stream. They're about 8 to 9 hours each. One of them took double that, took 16 hours. If you like watching long live playthroughs, you can watch those. And more importantly, at the end of each of those playthroughs, we have a long discussion and review of the game with spoilers. So if you do play these games, or if you want to play them along with us on the live stream, those might be the more satisfying reviews to watch because you'll get my live thoughts in the moment, having played the game, talking about the real specifics of each case. Okay, so there's that. If you like this kind of thing, you might consider subscribing to the channel. This review will be deliberately vague and spoiler-free. So here's a little outline of what we're going to do. I'm going to talk about the history of these games because that's sort of the selling point for me and the really interesting thing. Then we're going to look through one of these books, the first one, I think, and take a look at what the groundbreaking physical evidence style of book this was and how influential it was. But then I will just sum up my overall thoughts of the series and rank the games from best to worst. And then you can tap out at that point and not watch the rest of the review if you think you might play these games. Part 2, I will take a deeper dive into each of the books, talking about the things that I thought were special about the books or the weaknesses, some from a game design perspective. Then I'll sum up my longer thoughts on the series as a whole. And then I'll mention a little bit about related games that came after these and some advice for playing these games. So let's get started. I'm recording this in 2022, and currently the style of cold case, or sometimes what I call mystery suspect games, is very popular. They're all over Amazon. Tons of different companies are churning these out at a rapid clip. If you're interested in this genre, you can find some playlists on this channel reviewing individual different games from different companies and talking about the genre as a whole. So what is this genre? In general, they're framed as cold cases. So here's a crime that was committed and it's been unsolved, and can you solve it? You're provided with a box, a stack of documents of different types. Letters, police reports, interview transcripts, found evidence on the scene of the crime, Some of the companies work very hard to make very believable facsimile objects. Some are focused on sort of novelty props like objects, can openers, and stuff like that. But there's a huge focus on thematically immersing you into a crime by giving you physical objects to examine and study and look for clues. Essentially, the documents, the stack of unordered documents, is the game, is the case. You typically get these all at once. You have to figure out how to make sense of them, what they are, what they're referring to, where they fit in, what order they may have come out, and often not told where they were found or how they were related to anything else. That's part of the puzzle you'll have to solve. It's a little bit controversial to call these games because typically there are no actions you take. There's no time limit. You simply go through all of the documents, read everything, try to answer the question that the game poses you, which is typically, who is the murderer? Of the suspects you're presented, these games are framed as, here are all the different suspects, they've all been interviewed, here's their alibis, figure out which one is contradicting themselves in their interview or which one had the motive, the means, the opportunity, the weapon, and then figure out who did it. Occasionally you're asked for things like provide the piece of evidence that proves that they did it or find the murder weapon, etc. They're non-replayable, non-destructive, no randomness. Now that you're reacquainted with the modern concept of a cold case mystery suspect game, let's cast our minds back to the 1920s, 1930s when such a thing does not exist. This was a time when what was popular were escapist mystery detective novels, super hugely popular. And one sort of tradition in this golden age of mystery novels was this idea of what's sometimes been called a fair play detective mystery. And there have been a bunch of interesting essays and articles written about this idea of presenting a mystery with certain guidelines that lets the reader follow along and have a fair shot at trying to solve it along with the detective. So there are all these guidelines about how the evidence shouldn't be discovered and not shared with the player, and certain things would be considered cheaty. And there's a whole bunch of modern games that sort of spun off of this idea of a fair play mystery novel. Dennis Wheatley, born 1890-something, 1895, 1897, was a hugely prolific writer. He wrote crime mysteries, but also is very well known for writing occult mystery stories. And he liked to try his hand at different kinds of stories with different protagonists and different settings. And he talks about the generation of this idea to make these crime dossiers. So he gives credit to his friend J.G.Links, who came up with this idea. And they produced in 1936 the first crime murder dossier book. What you're looking at here, called File on Bolitho Blane, is the 1936 copy. This is the American copy. So what happened is Dennis Wheatley and J.G.Links made this crime dossier in 1936. They called it Murder Off Miami. And it was such a huge hit, sold hundreds of thousands of copies, that it was immediately purchased by an American company, which produced it as their first crime file in this series, renamed it for reasons that aren't clear. And then the Americans spun off their own 3 further books that are different from the 4 in the British version. But we're going to look at the British version, and then we'll look a little bit at the reprints. But first, let's look at this one. So it was presented as if it was a police dossier, hard cardboard back tied together, binding all of the documents together. And the idea here, as you can see, it's written by Dennis Wheatley and planned by J.G.Links. And the idea was to make it feel like you were reading the actual police file on this case. So we're going to flip through this and take a look at what was novel about this compared to a detective mystery novel. So there's a little bit of the introduction about this idea that this is a totally new idea. This was hugely expensive to produce, and barely anyone made any money because it was so expensive and because it had to be hand assembled. But this will just give you a feel, and you can see this is the progenitor of the current mystery suspect document games. You can see it's got a Western Union telegram, memo, these are things in different card stock. Here we've got statements, interviews from the police, photos, letters that were found, documents that were found, some double-sided, more crime scene photographs. And all of this evidence that's in here is described in the text. Like the text will be a police report and it'll say, please see the attached photo that was taken at this time of this person. Real physical evidence. Here's a piece of cloth cut out with a blood stain on it. These aren't spoilers. These are things you'll just read. Here's a map. And then in some cases, you'll see lots of interviews, writings. This book, here's a fingerprint chart, more telegrams, and then somewhere here, there are actually envelopes of evidence collected at the scene. The evidence is presented as it is encountered. Here's piece of evidence, hair, matchstick, photo of cigarettes, etc. And then you'll get to the end of the book and it will tell you, don't break the strip until you've decided who is the murderer, and then you will open it up and read the solution to the case. All four of the books follow this same general approach of having police evidence and real physical evidence found at the scene of the crime and photos, some more than others. All right, let's think about let's talk about the different editions of this that came out. So this was 36 in Britain, then this is then released in America, same year, slightly renamed, but almost same exact book and format. And then each subsequent year, 37, 38, 39, the same pair, Dennis Wheatley and J.G.Links, released another Crime Dossier. I don't have the original 1930s version of those. I have the 1979 versions, which are here. These are very faithful reprints. So here's Murder Off Miami, which was the alternate name for a file on Bolitho Blane. And you can see there's the original copy as it would have been seen in 1936. These are essentially identical to the one you just saw. The paper stock looks all the same. The actual physical evidence is exactly the same and was reproduced. And this was originally listed for $18. You can get these 1979, 1980 versions off eBay. Currently, it's not difficult to find them for maybe about $20 each. They are essentially identical to the 1930s versions. In addition, however, there were some reprints that came later in the late 80s, I believe, 1986. These hardcover versions, which are also available used on Amazon and on eBay, are not as good. They're all printed on stock, same identical paper. There's no physical different kinds of things in here. There's no physical evidence. There are no bags. There are no physical items. Everything is just photocopied when it would have originally been in a plastic bag or as a different kind of stock of paper. And some of that actually might be relevant for the mystery. So if you can't help it, you could get by with the hardback 1986 editions, but really what you want to be aiming for is the 1979 early 80s editions. And let's look actually at the different sets. You can see the different Murder Off Miami looks like it's probably the biggest. Then Who Killed Robert Prentice. Then the Malinsay Massacre, and then Herewith the Clues, which is the thinnest and smallest one. The Malinsay Massacre has the least physical evidence, and Herewith the Clues has the most. Just to give you some idea of what we're talking about here, you can see the whole middle of the book is filled with packets of envelopes of physical clues. All right. So that gives you some idea of what these were and the editions that came out and how rare they are. That you can definitely get them on eBay. And you'll note they're books. They're books meant to be read sequentially. And you could ask, are these books? Are they games? Are they activities? I think, as I've said, the lines are blurred. They're only games in the sense that you can be wrong at the end if you guess wrong, but that's not really the point of these. So I think these are probably best considered as sort of like activities. You're reading the book, you're going back, you're searching for clues, you're trying to figure out, you're trying to answer the questions at the end. But book, game, activity, either way, it's all about how much fun you have engaging in it. As promised, I'm going to sort of do a wrap-up of part 1 and give you my bottom line thoughts on this so that you have a chance to go play these games before watching anything else. This series of 4 crime dossiers is absolutely essential if you are interested in the historical trajectory and aspects of these kinds of games. If you're a fan of mystery games and want to see the sort of start, the birth of these kinds of games, absolutely essential. It does feel like you're watching the birth of a genre. You can feel it. You can see it. And part of the reason you can see it so tangibly is that the books evolve over these 4 years. Over the course of these 4 books, Dennis Wheatley is experimenting. He's experimenting with how to tell story. He's experimenting with how to frame the role of the player in the mystery. And you can see the evolution of the trajectory from a novel to a game. The first book just asks you who did the murder, and it doesn't even quiz you on being right or wrong. It just asks you that, and then it tells you the answer. But by the time he gets to the 4th book, there's a whole bunch of questions you're asked and a way to get a score at the end of it. So it's actually fascinating to watch Wheatley experiment with different things and then experiment with moving it towards more of a game. There are definite weaknesses compared to the modern mystery games involving puzzle solving. However, there is some real genius in these 4 games that is lacking in the modern mystery suspect cold case games. Some ideas that have been lost and a different kind of focus on quality writing that has been lost in the modern games. And so if you're interested in the kind of design elements, these books are filled with fantastic discoveries and pleasures. Unlike the modern mystery suspect cold case games, here the star is really the writing quality, not the nuts and bolts of the puzzles. There is long, dense, nuanced narrative here, and long dialogue and focus on characters and adult settings and human pathos, and really taking the time to spend time developing these characters and looking at their internal lives. So you have to ask yourself, does that appeal to you? Does the idea of spending more time reading a slow narrative that develops character arcs and personalities and gets you invested in the characters, or are you just here to solve puzzles? If the former, then these games are for you. They absolutely do feel like they're set in their time. The writing style, some of the phraseology, some of the settings, some of the behavior feels like it's in the 30s, and it may sound a little weird to modern ears, but if you like that idea of traveling back in time and experiencing something that was all created by people who are long dead, and give you a taste of what it was like in the 30s and what these old detective stories used to be like, then you will enjoy this. There are also a couple things in this series that are missing from the modern mystery suspect cold case games, and a huge one is that these are framed as a linear sort of story, a linear progression of evidence that comes in. And each of the books do it differently, but they all share the idea that as you're going through this crime dossier, time is passing. First you see, in the first book, it's framed as 5 different reports over time from the police officer on the ground there. So the first report is his initial interaction with the crime scene and the people, and then as the subsequent days and reports go on, he's following up on information, getting more information from headquarters. And that creates a progression of events. Events can happen, things can be discovered over time that change what you initially read. That is missing from almost all of the modern cold case games, where you just dumped a bunch of documents and there's no sense of time passing. It's really a remarkably enjoyable experience, and it's something that's missing from the modern games. And the ending has that flavor too. The ending is sort of like the last chapter, and it's a very long, fleshed out ending for almost all of these books that is very emotionally satisfying, rewarding, and it's something that I've criticized in my reviews of these cold case mystery suspect games. They often end with, yes, here's the person that did it and here's why, and maybe like one paragraph about them being locked up if you're lucky. This game treats it as if you're reading a novel and you want a satisfying, rich ending. They also have, because they can stage this stuff over time, most of these books have some very cool twists and surprises that happen either within the narrative of the story proper or at the end. If the primary pleasure you get out of playing these kinds of mystery games is sort of testing your wits, focusing on deduction of puzzles, finding tiny little clever clues or contradictions in what people say, or picking up a little statement that someone reveals something else, if you're really trying to play these games for the deduction element, these are not going to satisfy you compared to the better modern version of these games. This is not about the puzzle. This is not about clever chains of reasoning and aha moments where you finally everything clicks in and it all makes sense and you feel proud of yourself. These early books were struggling with the calibration of how difficult to make things, and they veer wildly from being too easy to impossibly hard, and clues that you would never put together. And some of the dated stuff and the evidence from the 30s doesn't hold up, so that it's not really reasonable to be able to make the conclusions that the game tells you at the end how it was solved. And some of the crimes and solutions feel a little bit cartoonish or cheaty, just not up to the level of the best puzzly type of these games. Okay, so some advice for those who think they might go out and buy these games and play them. The first thing is, it seems to me, for this kind of game, this mystery genre game, setting your expectations properly is half the battle. If I tell you this is the most amazing game, the most amazing story and mystery and puzzles, you're going to play it and be like, it didn't live up to the hype. So let me try to tamp down your expectations. Go into these games for the enjoyment of traveling back in time to see the birth of this genre, and focus on the historical elements and what feels different, what is elements that have been forgotten in the modern age, and try to just soak up this idea of being back in the 30s and seeing Wheatley, this writer, figure out how to tell a mystery game, how to tell a story in a way that's like a game, and try to enjoy how he's experimenting with that stuff. Another piece of advice, find a friend to play it with. You absolutely can play these solo. There's no reason not to if you don't have someone to play with. But these games are very well suited to being played remotely if you each have a copy or one person with a webcam showing it. And having someone you can bounce ideas off of and talk with, that really helps for these games. Although the one thing I will say is, I'm going to advise that unlike some of these games, I don't think it's worth spending an inordinate amount of time trying to solve the mystery and trying to find the tiniest clues to put everything together to give you a complete, pat, confident idea of what happened. One of the axes that I talk about when I review these games is, when you get to the end, are you meant to be sure of what happened? If you found all the evidence, will you exactly know what happened without a doubt? Or are you never given enough evidence to be confident of what happened? And I think in this set of 4 games, it veers quite a bit between them. But in general, I don't think it's worth trying to hunt down every little needle in a haystack to wrap up with a completely confident idea of what happened. And in fact, with most of these games, you won't be able to. So don't stress it. Read it, study the clues, formulate an idea, and then go into the ending. So because of that, it might be more suitable for solo play than some of the really hardcore puzzly mystery suspect games where you don't want to get to the end and have overlooked something. Okay, let's wrap up part 1 of this review by ranking the games. My favorite, by quite a large margin, is Who Killed Robert Prentice. This is the second book in this series, and to me, this is the one that read most like a novel. There's like the introductory evidence is like 30-page autobiography letter written to you by one of the main characters. It's got a very small cast and just very emotionally engaging. It's got, in my opinion, the best writing. Feels most like you're reading something written by a skilled, nuanced adult writer. And it is a fascinating story and very emotionally engaging. So that is my number 1 by a wide margin. If you only play one and you want to experience a game that's different from the modern mystery suspect games, this is it. This feels most like a novel. My second in order is the Malinsay Massacre. This one has got flaws. It has very little evidence in it, but it's told in such an interesting framing, and the sense of time passing is quite enjoyable. To me, again, this is the next one that feels most like a novel. This was the 3rd book they made, and there are some interesting blogs on Dennis Wheatley and these crime dossiers. You can imagine historically they were very important, so people have written about them. Some of the blogs consider this the worst one, but definitely not for me. If you're in it for the puzzle, you might find that one not as satisfying, but for story, I like it best. Now, 3rd in the ranking for me is Murder Off Miami, otherwise known as File on Bolitho Blane. This one I consider, I mean, this is historically the most important one. It's the first one. To me, it feels more like a novelty. The evidence is less relevant, it's more gimmicky, and it feels more like a short story. But there are some real moments of humor in this one, and it might be the easiest one to solve. So yeah, this wouldn't be a bad place to start. And you can find the PDF of this one on old Internet Archive, archive.org. Search for Dennis Wheatley. You could actually play this if you're curious about these games. You could play this one just by going through the PDF. And then fourth in my rankings is the fourth book, Herewith the Clues. This is 1939. The last book they made. And this is the one where they responded to complaints that there wasn't enough evidence in the previous book by just dumping tons of evidence in the middle of the book, so they didn't space it out. And it feels like Dennis Wheatley sort of went on vacation. Not much writing in this one, not much involvement. Doesn't feel like a novel, but maybe this is the one that was the closest to the modern games. And there actually is a scoring system in here and much more of a constraint satisfaction puzzle element. So if you're really interested in that stuff, if you don't like story, but you're interested in puzzle elements and want to see the last iteration of this set, then you could check out this one. The only slight problem is that the actual physical evidence and clues from the 1930s, some of it does not survive well, and some of it is information that you'll never know, not being in that time. But that can be part of the fun of it, seeing this stuff that when you read the solution, you're like, that makes no sense to me. You'd have to know something about the culture of the 30s that you won't know to explain some of the evidence and clues. So for the amusement factor, maybe check out that one. But definitely the least successful in terms of overall experience. Jonathan Warner, who played this game along with me on the live streams, says he might reverse these orders and put Murder Off Miami as ranked second. And again, since that's the one you can download PDF, that might be the one to check out. So now you can, if you think you might want to play these games, you can pause the video, you can go play them, come back, watch part 2 of the review after you've played it, or if you're sure you're not going to play it, you can continue watching the review, or you can go watch the live streams and hear the full spoiler-filled reviews, or watch the live streams after you play them. But there you go. Pause the tape, and we'll continue with a more in-depth look at each of these books. So this is part 2 of the review for my true aficionados of the genre. Just a reminder that you can watch the full playthroughs on YouTube. They range from 8 to 16 hours each of each book. And at the end of those, there's a long, rambling, spoiler-filled discussion of the case and how satisfying it was and where it worked and pros and cons. I'm going to keep the rest of this spoiler-free, but I will talk about sort of design issues and what I thought the strengths and weaknesses of each book was. Okay, let's talk about the first book, Murder Off Miami, otherwise known as File on Bolitho Blane in America. You can imagine the historical relevance of this book. It's sort of set Britain on fire with how amazing and cool and different it was. I do think it has a little bit of the flavor of being a novelty item. The evidence is often just there for the excitement and novelty of having something physical to look at and feel, but is not relevant for solving anything. And that's sort of a through line of this book, that most of the evidence and stuff is not important for you to figure out. It has maybe the thinnest actual storyline, and feels the easiest. The key mechanic in this book is, well, let's put it this way. The framing of this book is as a series of 5 reports from a police officer or detective who's on the scene tasked with solving this case, which is set in this one place. And so as he writes his reports that we read in the form of this dossier, one after the other, we see him trying to solve it. The main thing we see after some initial start is his interviews of the main suspects. And he re-interviews them several times as the book proceeds in time. So he does his initial interviews, then he might get some feedback from headquarters or some information on someone, then he re-interviews them and presses them, and we're already seeing stuff that's missing from modern games that is sort of shocking to see how well it works and why the modern games have lost this. So it's very common in the modern mystery suspect games to see interviews with suspects. They are always in the form of, here's the 1-page interview with this person. And that's it. They're interviewed once. They give their information. There might be contradictions there. There might be some interesting, humorous interactions as they're questioned, but that's it. Here, what we see is an initial interview and then a follow-up interview when the detective has gained more information and listen to the other people, what they say, and then can confront one of the suspects with what someone else said. And then this happens again and again. And it's a dramatic change in how you relate to these characters because you see them interacted with multiple times. You see the personality of the detective come through. You get more of a chance to see the personality of the suspects come through. And you see a little bit of behind the scenes police work where he's pitting one person against another, where he's pressuring people in different ways or appealing to them for their different motives. It's actually startlingly better than the way the modern games are done. And again, this sense of time passing, that things can happen between the first report and the second report. He gets information back from headquarters about certain people. He might ask them to do something to look up some information. The writing quality is outstanding. I mean, you really feel like you're reading something from someone who's a novelist rather than an amateur game maker. Although we just get a taste of it in this first book. It's only the second book and the third book where we really see the skill of Wheatley in his writing. It's got a very nice variety of documents, letters, handwriting, printed, lots of different kinds of police reports. So for an excitement factor, just a novelty factor, interest factor of seeing all these different things here and seeing the birth of this idea, this is a pretty amazing experience to go through this. And but this is the toe in the water. The end question is just who's the murderer, and then we get a nice summary of what really happened. But feels like a short story to me. I did want to add a couple more things that are sort of special about this first book in the series already doing things that modern games are missing out on. One thing is that there's a proxy for the player in this game in the form of this detective who's on the scene trying to solve the case. And it's actually fascinating the way that's framed. He's got a personality. He's not a genius. This is not Sherlock Holmes that is ahead of us. This is more like someone who's on our level trying to solve this case. And we get a sense for this person, a sense of their personality and a sense of their struggle to understand this case that they don't. And that's quite enjoyable. But the other thing mechanically that this does that's quite different from the modern versions of this game, and I'm sort of undecided about how well it works but I think I do like it, and it's followed through in the other books as well, which is that our protagonist, the person that's sort of the proxy for us in this game, periodically sums up evidence and conclusions from that evidence, or at least assumptions based on that evidence. So throughout this game, you'll see this evidence and you'll listen to people in their transcripts, and then you'll be formulating things like, oh, then that must mean this person might have done this or couldn't have done this. But in this book, in the reports that the police detective is writing, these 5 reports, he basically sums up that information. He's like, well, based on what this person said, here are the earliest times these people could have been on the scene. Or here's the reason this person should be ruled out because of this information they gave us, or this evidence we found. And that really dramatically changes the kind of grunt work you have to do. So normally if you play one of these mystery suspect games, you might have to sit there with detailed notes trying to work out the timeline, saying, okay, this person was here at this time, or this person had this alibi and did it check out. Whereas here in this game, our protagonist, our proxy, is summarizing all of those sort of facts that we would otherwise have had to sort of keep notes on and not use any deduction, but just sort of work out the details, keep track of all the details. And that makes playing through this a more breezy, enjoyable experience. You can focus on the writing in the novel knowing that it's not a guarantee. When he says, I don't think this person could have done it because of these reasons or this timeline, you have to remember, this isn't the game telling you, player, it couldn't have been this person, so cross them off their list. You cannot take it that for granted. It's just what the detective on the scene is summarizing his thoughts. He might be wrong. You can't take it as a sure thing. He might have missed stuff. But the fact that the game is doing these nice summaries of timelines and motives and alibis means you don't have to do that grunt work. And it makes it a more breezy, enjoyable experience, in my opinion. The second book in the series, Who Killed Robert Prentice, is my favorite by quite a substantial margin. And here's where we see that Dennis Wheatley is keeping true to his reputation of never resting on his laurels and trying different things, different settings, different sort of mechanics. This one feels like a novel. There are 2 big sections in this book that are like 20, 30 page monologue letters about one person's life. And they're writing to us, telling about their life. And it is very compelling reading. It's adult, it's nuanced, it's sophisticated, it's of a time that feels foreign to me, feels foreign to modern ears, and very compelling stuff. And, you know, you're in the hands of a real writer who's taking his time and confidently laying out character arcs and stories that make you feel like you're dealing with a fleshed out real person. It's like a film noir novel. This really feels like a film noir novel that you're in the midst of trying to solve. There's a small cast of characters which helps you completely relate to all of them. Like there's enough time for him to flesh out all of these characters in a way you feel very involved in, and they feel very real. Now, there's more real humanity and pathos in this game, and it's not nearly as lighthearted as the first game. There's not that much humor, but there is one element of this game that is quite remarkable, and again, the modern games could learn from. And I want to show it to you here. It's a newspaper. So I'm going to open this up so you can see this large newspaper. And it's multiple pages long. And I don't want to give away any spoilers, so don't stare too much at it. This may be the first real use of a newspaper in one of these kinds of games. The game that makes most use of this idea, of course, the modern game, is Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, 1981-1982. But the use of newspaper is quite different here. In Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, first of all, they're small little newspapers, and the idea there, which is quite clever in Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, is it's a newspaper with lots of little stories, and there may be little clues or little places to investigate or little tie-ins to your case scattered throughout all these little stories that you have to hunt for. In Who Killed Robert Prentice, the newspaper is used completely differently. First of all, it is a novelty prop. It has little fake advertisements that are sort of funny and a little asides occasionally. But the bulk of the newspaper is a story about the trial, the central trial in this book, in this story. And it is a very clever mechanic, a very clever way of telling this story in a different way, telling parts of the story. It's humorous. It allows the author to have little excerpts from different people. So instead of interview transcripts, we hear them being interviewed at the trial when they're up on the stand. And it allows the writer to give us different commentary from different people's points of view. We hear the defense lawyer questioning a person, and then the prosecutor questioning the person, and then the newspaper commentary on the trial. And it allows the authors to give little excerpts of the most interesting parts of the trial and interviews, and it gives us a much more sense of being in the court, a fly on the wall, listening to people. Do we think they're lying? And then they're not just lying, they're lying to a court, which might put them at some risk. They're being challenged with information. And then there's lots of room for humor in these interviews. And this newspaper is not just a short thing. It's a very long sort of middle interlude to the story that changes the way it's being told. And it's wonderful and fascinating. And then the other thing that's interesting is we're getting these long letters, these long like 20, 30 page autobiography letters from people. And there's some sort of psychological thing that happens when you get this long, open, what appears to be honest letters from people describing them. It brings up again this idea of an unreliable narrator. We're not sure if they're slanting things in their favor, if they're lying to us. So there's a lot of psychological thinking about the characters. Do we sympathize with them? And they're in these complicated adult situations, and they're morally ambiguous. And there's a lot of that in this game of thinking, do I sympathize with this person? Do I suspect them? Do I blame them for what they're doing? How do I judge them? Lots of shades of gray and lots of feelings in all of the Dennis Wheatley books, or most of them, but this one especially. There's a character development in your mind of how you view these people. On the initial reading, you're like, this is the culprit. This is the villain of this story. And then you read on and you change your mind. You're like, well, maybe they're not the villain. Maybe they're the person I sympathize with and regard as the person that I should be taking care of. This particular book does that best. This is also where Wheatley starts experimenting with making these games more movie-like in terms of surprises and twists and playing with expectations. So I don't want to tell you anything to give it away, but this is where he starts doing that in a very interesting way. And the ending questions get more interesting. It's not as simple as who do you think did the murder? It's a little more complicated. And again, the wrap-up is very emotionally satisfying. There were parts of this that when I was reading, I was just like totally immersed in this story and could feel my heart rate going up a bit as I was reading, and it felt special. So that's book 2, Who Killed Robert Prentice, my favorite of the set. The third book in the series is The Malinsay Massacre. This book has the least physical pieces of evidence, and some articles and bloggers who have written about the crime dossiers rank this as the worst of the 4. I disagree. For me, this is the second best of the 4. And it sees Dennis Wheatley again experimenting with framing the book and the nature of the story. It's told mainly from a protagonist who's not a detective anymore, but who's trying to solve a cold case himself in the 1700s. And it's told in the form of letters between two characters, but we mainly just see one person's perspective. And the game is actually playing with 2 different time scales here. We're set up this cold case, which is a little bit of reflective of the modern game's framing. So we're told about this cold case, and then we're reading these letters. It's a cold case in the 30s that we're asked to help with. And then we're reading these letters from the 1700s or so that made up this original old crime dossier. And they're letters not from a police, but from just a regular guy trying to deal with things that are happening to him personally and his family. And because almost everything is told in the form of these letters from this person, we really associate ourselves with him, and we really get attached to his struggles in his life. And he's got a real personality and flaws, and it's wonderful to see him interact with the other people in this story. He gets suspicious of them, and then he changes his mind about them. And again, you're reading the writing of someone who is a real writer. There are nuanced, subtle character development stuff that is really enjoyable to read. But it's also fun to read this unreliable narrator whose letters we're reading, who's trying to understand this. And in this case, again, like the rest of the books, time is passing. So we're reading letters as contemporaneous with these events that are happening, and things happen. And the letters talk about these things that are happening, and some of them we can see coming, and they're heartbreaking, and we're like, don't do that, don't go in that dark room with someone behind you. There's stuff like that that's happening that's very enjoyable. There are, in this case, though, you can see they're starting to get in the tendency of having too many side characters that are too distracting, that are just there as sort of red herrings. It's not so bad in this book. It's a manageable cast of characters, but some of them are a little weird and feel a little cheaty in terms of distracting from the story, etc. When we played this, we spent a lot of time trying to make sense of the mystery. There's sort of 2 mysteries in one in this game. And there was some real enjoyment in trying to figure out an explanation for things, trying to come up with a consistent theory of a case. So I want to say that if you're the kind of person who enjoys these games for the mental puzzle of trying to put together a theory of the case, and is okay when the game sort of cheats and left a lot of stuff out that you couldn't have known and comes up with an answer that's not very satisfying. If you can be okay with that, if you enjoyed the thinking part and you don't really care how it wraps up or if it was justified, then this may be a good one for you. You might enjoy this. If you're the kind of person who, when you read the end solution, you're like, that you hid information from me, or I don't agree with that. If that's going to ruin your experience, then you're not going to be happy with this, because I do think that the final solution makes some leaps and jumps that you may not really be thrilled with. And I think this is where the advice to not spend too much time trying to find every little needle in a haystack clue to come up with the exact right solution. Like, I don't think these games are made for that. I think you should read it, spend some real time thinking and talking with your friend about the solution, but then, don't spend 8 hours trying to nail down everything and make sense of everything. Just come up with your basic solution and read it. But like the first 3 books in this series, Wheatley is very attuned to the idea of providing a satisfying ending and taking his time telling you how the story unfolds and giving you emotional involvement in the ending, and there are twists and stuff. It's really, again, reads a bit like a novel. Now, when we played this, there were a couple of things that Jonathan Warner said that I think were accurate. One of the things that was a missed opportunity here, and if you're a game designer, if you're thinking about this, the framing in terms of letters worked very well. We're reading these letters from our main protagonist over time, and as his opinions change and as he discovers stuff, that worked very well. And there are actually some modern games that are told in terms of letters back and forth. That worked well. But what Jonathan said, which I think is true, is what would have really made this even better would be if we could have read some internal diary pages from this protagonist, because just reading these letters, he was little sort of framing things for the reader, and it might have been nice to see it might have been a good way to mix things up by having a little bit of different way of conveying information, or maybe letters from another character to him, etc., not just letters from him going out. And I do think, compared to the previous book, Robert Prentice, there was a little bit more emotional detachment from the characters here. We weren't as emotionally involved in these people. It was more of a locked room puzzle setting and not as much human pathos and humanity. But in this book, we start to see the use of the newspaper as Sherlock Holmes does it, where there's lots of little stories and some things to look for and hunt. And it's also the first time in the series where the questions at the end, you can see them evolving more towards a game. Now you're not just asked who did it, but why and how. What's your evidence for making certain conclusions? So again, seeing the evolution, very satisfying. Now we get to book 4, the final book in the series, produced in 1939. Also the thinnest, shortest book. This one returned to the idea, really focused on the idea of evidence. Tons of little pieces, of packets of physical evidence in the book, and they're quite extraordinary. It's a little bullet casing. But for me, the worst in the set, and maybe you can see why it wasn't nearly as popular and why it sort of let people down a bit. It's almost like Wheatley wasn't involved in this one. Gone is the telltale high-quality adult, subtle writing and story. There is no humor. There's really no emotional attachment to anyone. There's a complete overload of information. There's 16 characters. We don't hear from any of them. We hear like one line of dialogue from each of them. They're all very forgettable. We don't interact with them. We don't care about them. There's almost no sense of time. There's basically 2 acts to this story. The actual initial setup, which this returns to the idea of where a police detective called onto this case. The actual setup of the case is quite intriguing and pulls you in. It's a sort of terrorist sting operation. promising a very interesting sort of terrorist cell of political actors and revolutionaries. And then halfway through this very short story, it completely grinds to a halt and shifts to a locked room, Agatha Christie, who's the murderer case, throwing out all of the intrigue and interesting storyline that were promised in the beginning. The actual physical evidence to play with in this game is quite fun. It's very dated of its time, and in that way, some of it is quite interesting. A whole bunch of it doesn't really survive from the 30s. And there are pieces of evidence that in my copy were no longer usable. And luckily we had someone in the channel who did have a copy that, so the pieces of evidence that were no good anymore, we could salvage. It's okay though if one or two pieces of evidence doesn't come through, because nothing is, the gist of this game is not resting on having every piece of evidence found. But so there's a bunch of evidence that doesn't really survive from the 30s or the 70s in this case. And then there's a bunch of evidence that really is not going to make sense from 2022. There's just no way to look at it and make the inferences that the game wants you to make from it. So I talked about the 2 acts, and the second act being this sort of locked room, escape room that you're puzzle that you're trying to solve. Of all the books, this is the one that feels most like a modern puzzle game, and most like maybe the current mystery suspect type games, in that the basic framing is you've got 16 suspects and you've got all this evidence, and you're trying to match up. You're doing this correspondence between suspects and evidence to prove that they were in a room or not in a room. And you're basically, by process of elimination, giving everyone an alibi except the one culprit. So it does very much feel more like a traditional puzzle. And some of that is fun. I mean, it's a different kind of experience than the previous games. It's not psychological. It's just purely matching up what does this piece of evidence tell you about this person and who goes with what. And I do want to give credit to Wheatley. We've talked about the ways in which, in some ways, these 1930s games are more sophisticated and are using mechanics that have been lost to time and that the modern games are missing out on. So it's very common in the modern mystery suspect games to have each suspect have an alibi or an opportunity or a motive, and for you to find the evidence that proves this person's alibi checks out or doesn't check out, etc., or here's their motive. What's interesting here is there's this correspondence game where you're trying to say, well, this piece of evidence goes with this person and rules them out. And therefore it couldn't have gone with this person, so this person doesn't have a piece of evidence. And so it's a more interactive, where the consequences of, say, associating a piece of evidence with a certain player rules it out for someone else. And that's quite interesting. And along those lines of this being more of a game, moving more towards a puzzle game, in this one, when you get to the end, rather than saying, okay, who's the murderer, look at what you've got. You've got a whole sheet where you're supposed to answer these for each of the suspects. You're supposed to list the evidence that sort of exonerates them, that proves where they were. It's a little bit convoluted because it's not just saying for each suspect, give the evidence. It tells you, hey, half the suspects have one piece of evidence that definitively rules them out, and half the people have 2 pieces of evidence that each partially eliminates them. It's not entirely a successful mechanic, and it's probably overly complicated. It might be better if it just said for each suspect, tell us all the evidence you found that exonerates them. But this is the first book of the 4 that actually gives you a way of scoring. And you could absolutely see if 8 people were playing this, they would get different scores because the game says you get a certain amount of points for getting the right piece of evidence for the right person, and then you get double points if you found both of the piece of evidence that corresponds to a person. And everyone is not going to agree if you play this with a group. So that's very clever, and you can really see the leap to a game. This is an honest to God game now, where if you played with a group of people, you would all get different scores. Now, whether you're going to be happy with be convinced by the explanations for what the evidence proves and the story is a different matter, but this has become a game. Now, part of why it's not entirely successful is that the evidence is not entirely convincing in certain cases, and in some cases you're not going to understand how to make sense of these 1930s pieces of evidence. But the other ways in which this is the least of the 4 books, the least interesting, least satisfying, is the fact that they've thrown away the things that were so compelling about the previous books in terms of narrative and story. There's almost no explanation at the end of this game. So you open it up, you read it, here's the answer, that's it. There's no wrap-up story, there's no twists. You don't care about anyone. And it's odd in that you never find any affirmative evidence about the murderer or how the murder happened. You basically just rule out people, and when you've ruled out everyone, then you read the answer that tells you, well, the person that you didn't rule out is the one that did it. Here's your score. But not compelling, not interesting, and totally unsatisfying ending. And, the promise of this revolutionary terrorist cell stuff sets you up in one way, and the fact that it ends with this big letdown kind of takes the wind out of the sail. So I said there was no humor in this game, and I think that's true. The one place you might get some real amusement and some sort of perhaps unintentional humor is in the fact that some of these pieces of evidence don't make sense to the eyes from 2022. And it's kind of amusing to hear these conclusions that were made about this evidence, what this evidence means, or what you should have seen in a photo. Just stuff involving props and stuff that are totally foreign to us that we never would make sense of. And whether you view that as kind of funny and fun, or whether you view that as frustrating, only you will know. Okay, some final thoughts and discussion of design elements. I do think it's important to play these with expectations set relatively low and a focus on enjoying the historical aspects rather than expecting to be blown away by the hardcore mystery deductive elements. It is absolutely wonderful to play these in a series and watch the evolution even within this series, and then to know that this was the birth of the modern genre of cold case mystery suspect games. If you're a fan of mystery games, and especially the history of them, and understanding different ways things could be done differently, this is a unique experience, and an experience focused on high quality writing in a way we don't see in modern games. And there are surprisingly important ideas for mechanics and framing in this set that inexplicably are absent from the modern games. You're faced, if you play these, with the normal dilemma of these mystery games of how much time you should spend trying to solve the cases and find all the evidence. And I think maybe if there's one thing that would be useful, a resource for all of these kinds of mystery games, is someone telling you how much time you should spend really trying to find each needle in a haystack and really figuring out how to put together the pieces. And I think my advice for you for these games is don't spend too much time trying to definitively solve them and finding every little needle in a haystack. Enjoy them as if you're reading novels. Spend a little bit of time trying to understand them, but then read the end and appreciate it. Let's talk a little bit about the successes from a design perspective and then some of the weaknesses. One huge success and a lesson for the modern game designers is the benefits of linearly ordering the evidence and the story. The advantages of that system, of binding these as a book and having you read the evidence in a linear order, the advantages of that are huge, and it's missing from the modern games. It means you can tell a story, you can pace it the way as an author, as a writer you would do. You can do character development, you can do twists, you can have time passing and have the players really feel like things are happening during the course of this game. Rather than the way these modern cold case and mystery suspect games are done, which is just dump on you a bunch of unordered documents and have you solve it and then the game's over. This feels much more like you're on a ride. Related to that is that these feel like sort of film noir movies where there are twists and surprises and surprise endings. And that is missing from almost all of the cold case mystery suspect games. Occasionally some of the better ones have a little double 2-act thing or a little summary story. These really do have twists and surprises. And the focus on the writing means that the endings are much more satisfying and much more engaging. When you read the end, you feel like you've gotten a full story that you've been part of. Okay, another successful thing is the use of a sort of proxy for the player being a character with a personality, with risks and flaws. And I think as we were playing these games, we felt like, wow, that was cool and different, and we wanted more of it. In the modern games, like if you play a Hunt-A-Killer standalone box or some of the old cold case, the framing of the game is, dear private investigator, here's the files and the evidence, see if you can solve it. You don't ever interact with anyone. You are a disembodied third party. You have no role in the story at all. In these games, or at least the first three, not so much the fourth one, the first three, we are sort of peeking over the shoulder of someone involved in the case, sometimes just trying to solve it. So we're riding along with the detective who's trying to solve this case. In this one, we're sort of a backup person called to solve the case. And in this one, it's a little more complicated, but we're seeing it through the eyes of one of the players in the story. But in all of the cases, we see the personality of the person who's a proxy for us. And we see them struggling to understand what's going on. And being able to play with that makes it more engaging. Another theme with all of these books, which is related to that, is the idea that the police and the judicial system can be flawed. And that's sort of sneaks in. It seeps into these books in a way that makes you doubt the conclusions of the police always and of the judicial system. And it adds an extra layer to your thinking. To know that people may be making mistakes. If you accuse someone, are there consequences to that, etc. There are a couple of very clever pieces of evidence, like the use of the newspaper to do a trial as an alternative way to hearing from the players in a different setting. And the idea of being able to, that time passes, the idea that we change our opinions about characters is not seen in these modern games. The modern games do not spend enough time with any one character and developing them and hearing from them and hearing their voice for us to develop a real feel for them, and certainly not for us to actually change our opinion of them through the arc of the story. That should be adopted by the modern games. The focus on a satisfying ending, at least with the first three, is really welcome. And I've talked about this when I review the modern games. It is so disappointing when you get to the end of these modern games and it just tells you, yes, this person killed it, and then they went to jail. There's no emotional satisfaction. These games are all about writing a novel, a story that's emotionally satisfying, especially these middle two. Heavy in character development, heavy in fleshing out the characters and making you care about them and seeing them as real people. And heavy in making the ending satisfying. Now let's talk about some of the design weaknesses in this early version of Mystery Suspect Cold Case game. You've heard me talk about the fact that the deduction and puzzly nature of this game sort of falls a little short of our modern versions. And I think there's a sense that the designers, and you can imagine they have nothing to base this on. This is the first shot at this. But they didn't quite know how to calibrate how difficult the evidence should be, how difficult the case should be for the player at home to be playing. And obviously that's a tough problem even in modern games. You don't want to make it too easy, you don't want to make it too hard. It's impossible to get that balance right for all players. And you can see they're sort of shifting between making it too easy and then making it too hard, and then trying to make it more gamey and make it more psychological. And it's not entirely successful, and maybe it's impossible to make it perfectly successful. But it's absolutely true that the caliber of the deduction and the clues and the hidden information in this whole set is way below the best of the modern modern versions of this genre. I've reviewed a whole bunch of these kinds of games, the modern ones, and for my money, the Adventure series, detective stories, there's 4 or 5 boxes in that set, are the pinnacle of that. If you really want to challenge yourself to understand a mystery, you can see my review of that series. Those are heavy in very satisfying deductive chains of reasoning. And this doesn't have any of that. This is much more focused on story. It's also not completely fair in the sense that there are solutions to most of these, at least to this middle two, my favorite two, that are information that is not shared with you, the detective. So that can be frustrating that we aren't privy to certain information, and certain conclusions seems like completely leaps of logic, and maybe they could have done better there. But a couple more thematic complaints. Jonathan Warner pointed out that these are all murders, which is a little bit of a missed opportunity to have something a little more varied. For me, though, one of the things that jumps out, and actually Jonathan Warner talked about this a little in the Malinsay Massacre, the focus here is on developing, fleshing out characters and emotional involvement in the characters. But what is missing is a sense of place and atmosphere. And that's kind of surprising. And you might contrast that to something like Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, which is on the opposite end of that scale. In Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, the actions you make, the decision you make, and every clue you read has to do with going to a place. And the whole way that the stories in Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective are told give you a feel of being in a real place. You're described buildings and locations and people in their environment in a way that really makes you feel like you're traveling back in time and seeing this place, this living, breathing city of London. And everyone's placed in it in a particular place and setting, and you're interacting with the people and things and hearing about these different buildings and activities. There's really none of that here. All of these are focused in like one little room, one little place, and very little time is spent describing the locations, the locales, and the activities going on in those locales. It's really focused on the people and their personalities, and that's a little bit of a missed opportunity. It would be nice to get more of a sense of place and atmosphere in these games. If you're interested in the crime dossier genre as a sort of sub-niche of the mystery suspect cold case games, there are other games for you to consider. So in addition to the 4 games in the original British series from the 30s, as I said before, the Americans licensed the first game. I guess this should be over here. The Americans licensed the first game, File on Bolitho Blane, otherwise known as Murder off Miami, and then produced in the 30s, contemporaneous with Dennis Wheatley's book, another 3 books written by different American authors. Now, I only have 2 of them. One is File on Rufus Ray by Helen Riley. This looks like it might be the biggest of all of them, but following the exact model of Dennis Wheatley. Then there's a 3rd one called File on Fenton and Farr, and the 4th one, File on Claudia Cragg by Q. Patrick, which is a pseudonym for a group of people. But I'm going to be playing File on Rufus Ray in the first week of March, and you can get a PDF of this online if you want to play along with us. And I'm particularly interested to see how the Americans spun off this set, and if there's a different personality behind the writing and the writing of a woman. The original games are dated in terms of focused on men and told from a man's perspective, and it would be very interesting to see how a woman tackles these things. These also from the 30s, 36, 37, 38. Then there were a bunch of crime dossier games that came out. Here's Murder Memo to the Commissioner from 1950s. This one doesn't have physical evidence, but tons of documents that are like police reports, facsimiles, and photos. We'll be playing this one on the channel eventually. Then there are 3 or 4 in a Sherlock Holmes series. And these are retelling Sherlock Holmes stories, but presented as crime dossiers, and they've got physical pieces of evidence in there. And I think if you know the Sherlock Holmes stories, you probably won't find these much of a mystery, but you can see they're told with pictures and documents and letters and stuff. They look very well done and high quality. And then there's a bunch of much more modern games. This series by Sam Stahl, he's got a CSI one and a Dracula one. This has got the same idea of physical pieces of evidence in little envelopes and photos and trying to put together mystery. And then one in Dracula, same idea. And then here's another one by a different author, Dwayne Schwarzinski, which is told Sherlock Holmes version, told in a story and little pieces of evidence and documents and newspapers and letters. So if you're a fan of the crime dossier real evidence type of book, you've got a bunch of choices. And then if you want to go a little further afield, all of the sort of choose your own adventures could be seen as sort of spin-offs for these games. There's a lot of those. There's a bunch more mystery books told in terms of correspondence between people or told in terms of a trial transcript. And then, of course, you have all the modern cold case mystery suspect games where you're just presented with a box of documents and you have to put them together and figure out how they work. Those are, again, much more focused on solving a puzzle of a mystery with deduction and constraint satisfaction. These are all story focused. You can watch my reviews of Mystery Suspect games and the different companies' collections. And I'd love to hear which ones you like best, and if there's any that I've overlooked, you can let me know in the comments.